Hi everyone, I'm number one Marmaduke fan. This is a presentation of my notes on the video, Jordan Peterson, What Matters? My goal for this series is to discuss the history of ideas and the individuals who have shaped these ideas. Though my primary goal is to offer a fair summary of the ideas I'm discussing, I also hope to simplify some of these complex topics as I discuss them. Please don't think of my summary as a replacement to listening to the original. Instead, maybe imagine that we are classmates in a study session, and I'm drawing on the whiteboard to explain what I've learned. The comment section is open, and I read all my comments because I appreciate your feedback. Dr. Jordan B. Peterson opens by stating he is not an atheist and uses wordplay to contrast the word matter with the phrase what matters. The word matter implies atoms, naturalism, materialism, the stuff that makes up the universe. The phrase what matters implies purpose or meaning of life. Peterson states that human brains orient toward meaning, which means that the idea of finding a purpose captures our attention. Peterson cites Martin Heidegger as an example of a philosopher who recognized the importance of meaning to human beings, in contrast with a modern view which de-emphasizes ultimate meaning or purpose. Peterson then begins to discuss details from the creation of Adam and Eve in Genesis, in which both Adam and Eve are created in the image of God. Peterson is not merely interested in the story itself, but the interpretation of the story across history. For example, Peterson alludes to a medieval interpretation of Genesis, which assumed that Adam was a hermaphrodite prior to the creation of Eve. Peterson is arguing that these different ideas about Adam and Eve contain important symbolic meaning in psychology. For example, the medieval interpretation of Adam and Eve connects with a deep human drive to be united with someone else, to become whole again. Probably the most important thing to underscore about Peterson's presentation is that he is interested in symbolic meaning. So the story of Adam and Eve is literally about a man and a woman. Peterson wants to focus on the concepts of masculinity and femininity in the human mind, how the brain thinks about masculine and feminine. Because both Adam and Eve are created in the image of God, Peterson argues that the feminist interpretation of the story is flawed because it sees Genesis as reinforcing patriarchal norms. Peterson asks how that can be the case if both Adam and Eve are created in God's image. To illustrate the idea of feminine as a symbolic category, an idea hardwired into our brains, you'll see on your screen that I've drawn a pregnant woman. This is a very literal illustration of the symbolic idea Peterson is focusing on. He calls femininity a genetrix, the matrix, or the source for new things. If you've heard the phrase, necessity is the mother of invention, that is a neat illustration of how we use motherhood and femininity as a symbolic idea. Similar to how a mother gives birth to new life through her womb, people give birth to new ideas. Peterson calls this symbolic femininity a mystery and an undifferentiated whole. My personal illustration for what this feminine symbol might be would be fertile soil, which gives life to young plants. If fertile soil is symbolically feminine, then seeds are symbolically masculine. To illustrate the masculine symbolic category, you'll see I've drawn a young soldier armed with sword and shield. Peterson describes the masculine category as seminal, logical, and cutting. If women nurture new life, then men instigate the process. When Peterson describes masculinity as a symbol for differentiating or cutting through things, I think of boys breaking things and putting them back together. If femininity symbolizes mystery, then masculinity symbolizes exploring and experimenting. This doesn't mean that women can't be logical or experimental and that men can't be nurturing, because Peterson is talking about symbolism. Both men and women have these symbolic ideas in our head, and they show up frequently in stories, like Adam and Eve. Returning to Genesis, Peterson interprets the story through a psychological lens. He thinks that Eve offering Adam the fruit of knowledge of good and evil symbolically represents how women make men self-conscious. When Adam hides from God, Peterson sees this as an illustration of Adam's foolishness and shame, because the woman has made him self-aware. Adam no longer feels he has stature before God. When Adam blames Eve, Peterson interprets this as a moment of Adam behaving almost pathologically. Adam shows ingratitude to Eve when he blames her. Peterson suggests that by offering Adam the fruit, Eve was essentially waking Adam up to reality. I think Peterson's interpretation raises a very important question about the meaning of Adam and Eve's story. What about sin? If the fruit of knowledge of good and evil is a metaphor for being made self-conscious, then Eve may have done a good thing in waking up Adam by offering him the fruit. But if eating the fruit is a sin against God because both Adam and Eve disobeyed God's commandment, then the moral of the story can't be that eating the fruit was ultimately a good thing. This question I have about Peterson's interpretation of Genesis will become important later. Is it a story about women waking up men to the dark realities of the world, or is it a story about both men and women falling short of the glory of God? Peterson refers to John Milton's Paradise Lost to illustrate how later generations were intensely interested in some of the moral and theological questions raised in Genesis. If God is all-knowing, then why does God put Adam and Eve in the garden with the forbidden fruit? Peterson argues that Milton's epic poem is an attempt to answer that question. Peterson sums up Milton's answer to the question as free will. God can't stop the fall of man without violating Adam and Eve's free will. Therefore, God allows them to eat the forbidden fruit. Peterson argues that Dostoevsky understood the value of freedom to human beings, and Dostoevsky's novels and short stories reflect this emphasis on free will. Peterson then discusses why there is a snake in the Genesis story. Peterson makes an argument based on evolutionary biology. A war for survival between mammals and reptiles, between chimps and snakes, has created a biological fear and fascination with snakes, a survival mechanism. We're scared of them, but we can't stop looking at them. To illustrate, Peterson points to how chimps exhibit snake wrath, screeching at the sight of a snake and gathering around to watch it. Peterson argues that myths reflect this fascination. You can see I drew a mean old snake on the left, but on the right I've drawn a dragon in the style of Chinese painting, where dragons are often seen as wise and good. So, here's a big question. Is the snake in Genesis Satan, or is it a metaphor for dangerous knowledge, what Peterson calls a catalyst for change? Peterson argues that even if the snake is Satan, he still functions as a sort of wake-up call for Adam and Eve when they are cast out of the garden. When Peterson discusses life in the painful, harsh world outside the Garden of Eden, what he calls the profane world, he argues that earthly suffering is key to religious thought. If the snake represents the other, mystery, the pain and suffering in the world, then the story of Cain and Abel continues that theme. If we follow Peterson's interpretation, Cain murders Abel out of rage. Cain thinks the world is just not fair, and killing Abel will somehow make the world more fair. Peterson wants people to avoid becoming like Cain, the first murderer, by learning to endure suffering. I believe that learning to endure suffering is a key aspect of what the Bible teaches people. But is it the only aspect? Is enduring suffering the fundamental thing to religious thinking? Here are my questions for this interpretation of Genesis. First, how does this symbolic interpretation square with the transcendental nature of the biblical stories? In other words, where is God in all of this? It is true that Cain murders Abel out of a sense of resentment and rage, but it's also true that Cain murders Abel in direct defiance of God. God's a character in both stories. If all religious thinking boils down to teaching people to endure suffering and live their best possible life, this de-emphasizes a critical part of the story, the judgment of God in the next life. This leads into a second question. Does the original intent of the author of Genesis matter to this psychological interpretation? Because Peterson is discussing symbolic psychological ideas in the story of Adam and Eve, it seems as though he is interested in multiple interpretations of this story across the centuries. But I see a contradiction between these two interpretations of Genesis. One about man sinning against God, and the other about man waking up to the harsh realities of the world. Would Peterson agree or disagree? These are two personal questions which I wrote down while listening to Peterson's lecture, but I won't try to delve into them here. Peterson continues discussing his ideas on individualism and enduring suffering by alluding to the philosopher Kierkegaard. Peterson sees individuality as key to our ability to endure suffering and understand the difference between tragedy and evil. Peterson sees tragedy, like the death of a loved one, as something the human mind has learned to cope with over time. But acts of monstrous evil, like the school shooters who murdered students at Columbine, aren't something human brains are built to cope with. We don't understand how such evil could possibly exist. Peterson says that many in the field of psychology view evil as something that can't be properly defined. Is evil a quaint religious notion? Peterson answers this question bluntly. Quote, "Evil is the production of suffering for its own sake." He ends the video by asserting that we can see obvious examples of this kind of evil in the world. I hope you enjoyed my illustrations and personal thoughts in this video. I don't plan to do a presentation on every lecture and debate Dr. Jordan Peterson has ever done, but I do plan to briefly discuss more of Peterson's key ideas as I work through his lecture series, in a similar style to this first video. I provided links to all the notes and illustrations I showed in this video in the description below. They are licensed under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution license. If you particularly liked my drawings, I've made some of them available on shirts and posters on my online store. I also want to thank my patrons on Patreon for this month. If you like what I'm doing, you can also support this channel's growth on Patreon, and you can support it by liking, commenting, and subscribing, and clicking the bell to be notified when I make new videos. I love you guys, and I'll catch you later.